I'm Luke Russell from the discipline of philosophy at the University of Sydney. What counts as a life well lived? How should we treat each other? How should we respond when things go wrong? Which goals should we pursue? And what counts as human flourishing? For thousands of years, philosophers have been thinking and arguing about these issues. In this series of podcasts, The Philosophy of Living Well, I'll be interviewing some philosophers and asking them what philosophy has to teach us about how we ought to live. The title of this episode is Choosing to Forgive, and my guest in this episode is Professor Lucy Allais, who splits her time between Johns Hopkins University in the United States and the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg in South Africa. Professor Allais is an Anderson Visiting Fellow at the University of Sydney. Lucy, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Luke. It's really been a delight being here.
Today we're going to talk about forgiveness. And forgiveness is one possible response to having been wronged. Being wronged typically makes us feel anger towards the wrongdoer, and often this anger leads us to blame and rebuke the wrongdoer, perhaps to demand an apology, or to seek to impose punishment, or to even exclude that person from our social circle. These are what we might call hostile responses to having been wronged. In contrast to these hostile responses, a victim of wrongdoing might instead decide to forgive the person who's wronged them. And many people present forgiveness as being a path to healing, a way for the victim to regain her own happiness, and a way for victim and perpetrator to move on together in peace. In this episode of The Philosophy of Living Well, I want to address two main questions relating to forgiveness. To what extent is forgiveness a choice? And do you think that it can be morally okay to forgive a wrongdoer whom you know to be unrepentant? To help us to understand these questions and to appreciate the high stakes of questions about forgiveness, I want to start with a true story. And it's the story of June Steenkamp forgiving Oscar Pistorius. Many of you will know Oscar Pistorius is a South African Olympic sprinter who killed his girlfriend, Reva Steenkamp. He was tried and convicted of murdering Reva. And Oscar denied any wrongdoing, saying he shot Reva, having mistaken her for being an intruder in the house. So this was an extremely high-profile trial in South Africa and attracted media attention around the world. Reva's mother, June, was interviewed by journalists before, during, and after Oscar's trial. And from June's comments, it's clear that she believes that Oscar is guilty of murder and that Oscar ought to be punished with the full force of the law. But June also said, when speaking to the press, even before the trial, that she'd already forgiven Oscar. And here's a quote from June Steenkamp. She says, "I don't hate Oscar. I've forgiven him. I have to. That's my religion. But I'm determined to face him and reclaim my daughter." Okay, so a pretty challenging story about forgiveness there. Lucy, in what sense is forgiveness a choice? Now, we might say that June Steenkamp chose to forgive Oscar, but on the other hand, June herself says that she has to forgive, which suggests that she has no choice in the matter. What's going on here?
Thanks, Luke. I think there are quite a few different things going on. So one question is just the question of whether whatever change forgiveness involves is under your voluntary control. So if you think, as I do, that forgiveness centrally involves an emotional change or a change of heart, there's some question about whether that's always under your direct voluntary control. Then the other issue is, what I think that June Steenkamp is really expressing, is whether or not forgiveness is morally obligatory.
Okay, so there's a difference between saying forgiveness is under my voluntary control and saying instead forgiveness is obligatory, or it's something that everyone morally is required to do. So, do you think there are cases in which people strive wholeheartedly to forgive but just find that they're incapable of doing it?
That certainly seems to be possible. If you think, as I do, that forgiveness centrally involves some kind of emotional change, a central issue is understanding what emotions are. And I think an interesting way in which emotions are different to beliefs is that they can sometimes be more subject to the will than beliefs are. You know, with that old cliche of count to 10 if you're feeling angry before, it actually literally can help bring anger down. So we do have some control. Also because I think emotions involve patterns of focus and attending. And that also is something we have some voluntary control of. But on the other hand, emotions can sometimes leave irrational residues or, in the case of phobias, be just cognitively impenetrable. Sometimes changing the beliefs doesn't change the emotions at all. So they are in some ways more subject to the will than beliefs are, and in other ways can just be completely resistant.
The emotions that are most commonly connected with forgiveness are resentment, blame, contempt. We might call these hostile, negative emotions. Emotions are under our control to some degree, and we certainly might make attempts to get rid of, to moderate or eliminate those negative emotions. Sometimes we might even discover that they just disappear without us trying to do anything at all.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think you could, with respect to somebody who wronged you some time ago, just one day wake up and realize, I've forgiven them. So I think forgiveness can be a real struggle, and you think you ought to forgive someone and you struggle and you just can't. But it can just sort of come completely easily. So I think there's just an enormous variety of kinds of cases.
Okay, so on your view, forgiving involves some kind of emotional change. And when you've forgiven, in some sense, you're saying the slate has been wiped clean, or that wrong is no longer going to be part of my evaluation of you.
Yeah, that's my view. So just to go back a step, just to the discussion we were having earlier about emotions, it's really important for this view because sometimes in like popular culture, people talk about emotions as opposed to reason. And lots of philosophical work and psychological work on emotions emphasizes the fact that emotions have content. They present the world in certain ways, and that content can be appropriate or warranted.
So one example of that might be the emotion of fear presents the feared object as being dangerous.
Exactly. And emotions don't have content like beliefs do that we evaluate as true or false, but we can definitely evaluate them as appropriate or inappropriate, disproportionate. You can say your fear is disproportionate, or you can say, well, look, it's really appropriate to feel fear in that situation. It's a scary and dangerous situation. So I think it's really an important starting point that emotions have content that can be warranted, that can be appropriate or inappropriate. When it comes to forgiveness, I think that what's at issue is a very fascinating and complex class of emotional responses that we have to persons' actions and what their actions reveal about their willing. For example, the emotional response of gratitude. I think it's essential to gratitude that it involves feeling. It's a way of feeling towards a person who's done something for you. And it's got really quite complex content. It sees them as having done something for you that went beyond what you were entitled to expect them to do for you. So this sort of simple opposition between reason and emotions would really be undercutting this very, very complex content. I think all these emotional responses which respond to persons' actions have this fascinating structure of kind of me seeing you, seeing me, seeing you as part of them. They're really interpersonal, and they're absolutely central to our lives. They're just a huge part of what we care about.
Right, so someone might show me goodwill or ill will in the ways that they treat me, and gratitude seems like it's the appropriate emotional response for me to direct towards someone who's shown me goodwill, and maybe resentment is the appropriate emotion for me to feel towards someone who's shown me ill will. So, Lucy, is resentment just the same thing as anger?
I think the emotional involving attitudes that are at issue here are not simple emotions. So a simple emotion like anger has one way of feeling. But if you think about an affect of, so a feeling involving attitude like, for example, contempt. My contempt to you might involve right now my feeling delight in your having a setback. So it's a complex set of feeling involving appraisals of a person. And those are the kinds of attitudes that I think are really key in forgiveness.
Okay, so there are various ways that you could lose your resentment. One is by forgiving. What are some of the other ways of losing resentment?
So this is a question that's sort of been at the heart of philosophical attempts to characterize forgiveness. And one of the things that has made many people think that forgiveness seems kind of a puzzling phenomenon is that some quite standard ways of stopping to have blaming feeling involve coming to see that blaming feeling is no longer appropriate. So the classic cases that philosophers like to talk about are excusing, justifying, and accepting. So suppose I'm late to meet you and you're annoyed, and then it turns out that like all the public transport broke down. You realize that I've just got a completely valid excuse. It's just not my fault. Then your anger might dissipate. Or suppose I'm late to meet you, you're annoyed, and then I rush up and I say, I had to rush somebody to hospital in an emergency. And then you'll say it was totally justifiable.
So these are cases where your anger goes away, but it's not the case that you've forgiven the person.
Yes, exactly. So I think in those cases, the anger goes away because you come to see that there's nothing to forgive. So what's puzzling about forgiveness is that it seems to be a way of overcoming or releasing or getting rid of blame that continues to be appropriate. In the justifying, excusing, and accepting case, you get rid of blame by coming to see that there's nothing to forgive. Forgiveness is only at issue when there's unexcused, unjustifiable, unacceptable wrongdoing. And you might think, well, if that's the case, you shouldn't give up blame. And that's one of the things that makes philosophers think that forgiveness is a puzzling phenomenon.
One of the ways that psychologists and self-help therapists often talk about forgiveness makes me think that they're actually talking about excusing. So they might say, here's how you forgive, say, a parent who wronged you. You come to see that they didn't really mean it and that your feelings were inappropriate because it wasn't really their fault. Philosophers are going to call that excusing rather than forgiving. And forgiving is the case where you think it was that person's fault. There was no good excuse. And yet you're going to move past your resentment.
Yes, I think that's right. I think the core puzzling feature of forgiveness is that you really do see the person. It's unexcused, unjustified wrongdoing. They really did do it, and you're still somehow moving past it.
Okay, Lucy, you've suggested that forgiving crucially involves a change in emotion where you're moving past resentment and maybe other blamey feelings.
Yes.
Even though you think that the wrong was that person's fault, they had no good excuse. So in some sense, you're moving past those feelings while still judging that those feelings would be justified. So this makes it seem like forgiveness is some kind of puzzle, or maybe even that there's a kind of irrationality in forgiveness. You've got some degree of control as to whether you move past those feelings or not. You can certainly try to do it, and sometimes you can succeed. So let's move on to the second sense, in which we might ask whether forgiveness is up to you or is a choice for you. And this is the question of whether forgiveness is morally obligatory, whether when someone wrongs you, you really ought to forgive them. In fact, you ought to forgive everyone who wrongs you. We might describe this as the view that unconditional forgiveness is the moral ideal. And this is what seems to be in play in June Steenkamp's mind when she says that she has to forgive Oscar Pistorius. She has to because it's her religion. So this is a common view amongst Christians, but I think it's important to say not all Christians hold that view. Some Christians think that Jesus has taught us that we ought to forgive the repentant. No obligation to forgive people who have not yet repented. But there's a strong thread within Christianity that upholds that ideal of unconditional forgiveness, saying that when someone wrongs you, you ought to forgive them. Lucy, what are your thoughts about the idea that all victims of wrongdoing are morally required to forgive those who've wronged them?
So I don't think that at all. That's not a criticism of the Christian idea, because I think the Christian idea adds to the ordinary idea of forgiveness some extra reasons, some extra theological reasons, and that extra reasons could give you extra moral obligations. So I was talking earlier about these complex emotional responses that evaluate people in relation to their actions. We don't know anything about other people's characters and motivations other than their actions. And if you never see a person's actions as reflecting on them, I think you're not actually taking them seriously as a person. Taking somebody seriously as a person involves seeing their actions as reflecting on them. And I think you're just in general entitled to do that. So the idea that you could have a general obligation to not see a person's wrongdoing as reflecting their choosing, I think that would be kind of bizarre.
So you think sometimes blaming and resenting are justified?
Absolutely.
And you might think that they're justified in part because they are a show of self-respect from the victim.
It could be a show of self-respect. It could be a way of standing up against wrongdoing. And, a lot of philosophers have done a lot of work to defend anger and blame. Philosophers love quoting Aristotle, who says that a person should be angry at the right time, in the right place, to the right degree, for the right things. But also the British philosopher based in the US, Miranda Fricker, has done some really beautiful work on what she calls communicative blame, where she argues that although, of course, blame has all sorts of pathologies and we need to pay attention to those and be careful about the ways it can go wrong, it's actually an important interpersonal tool. And when, somebody you care for has hurt you, communicating to them with emotional force, with an aim to getting them to see and care about what they've done, which is what blaming is a crucial part of how we all keep each other sane and help each other morally grow. And so I think, obviously, it can go wrong and be excessive, but done appropriately and carefully, blame is just a crucial part of our ordinary interpersonal lives.
There's a different moral ideal in relation to forgiveness, in contrast to unconditional forgiveness, or the view that every victim should forgive everyone who wrongs them. There's what we might call a cautious and conditional ideal, which works like this. If someone wrongs you, you are entitled to feel resentment and to blame them, and typically you should do that. But when they've repented, apologised, made up for it and so on, then you should forgive them. This is a view that makes justified forgiveness conditional on repentance. Now, if something like that were correct, then June Steenkamp should not forgive Oscar Pistorius because he remains to this day unrepentant. But if Oscar did sincerely repent and apologise, then June should forgive him. What do you think of that conditional view of forgiveness?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's one of the central debates philosophers have about forgiveness. And you can see one of the things that makes the conditional view very appealing is what we were talking about earlier, about the things that make forgiveness seem puzzling. So we said the things that make it seem puzzling are that it's precisely when there is unexcused, unjustified, unacceptable wrongdoing that you give up blame. But it seems like, well, you shouldn't give up blame that's made appropriate by unexcused, unacceptable, unjustified wrongdoing. But when the wrongdoer takes all these steps, that does seem to be the thing that changed the situation. So now you can change your view. So you can see, I think, that there's a strong appeal to that kind of view. I want to question it in both directions, starting with the case in which, suppose Pistorius had been contrite. I mean, how much contrition makes up for the death of your daughter? Like saying sorry, does saying sorry, it's sort of unclear what you can do. And I also think that it's an important point that apologies and wanting to be a different person are not the same thing as being a different person. So the German philosopher Immanuel Kant says, if improvement were a matter of mere wishing, everybody would be good. It's very easy to mistake having apologized for being the better person you think you should be, but it's not usually that easy. I don't really know what it would take to show that you've made up for killing someone's daughter.
Okay, so you think that June should not have to forgive even if Oscar has apologized and tried to make up for the wrong. Now, what about the other kind of case? Can it be, in your view, permissible for someone to forgive even if there's absolutely no repentance from the wrongdoer?
My view of forgiveness is, I think, very unprescriptive as to whether and when people should forgive. But I do think that forgiveness is something we need in our lives and relationships and is generally a good thing. So I think never being forgiving would make it impossible to be in relationships. I'm quite reluctant to say of particular instances. In this case, the person ought or ought not to forgive, even though I do think in general, being forgiving is an important part of being in a relationship.
Lucy, in some of your writing about forgiveness, you've made the claim that forgiveness is elective. What does that mean?
So what I mean by that is that it's centrally at the discretion of the victim whether or not they forgive, that the victim has an enormous amount of discretion. So forgiveness is not something that a wrongdoer is generally entitled to insist they deserve. I think that forgiveness generally involves giving wrongdoers something that goes beyond what they deserve. So going back to what you were asking about a little while ago with this conditional account, the conditional account, I think one can see why it seems persuasive because it solves something that made forgiveness seem puzzling. But I think it undersells forgiveness. It makes it a matter of appropriately calibrating your emotional responses. And I think that puts forgiveness in what I call like a space of moral bookkeeping. And I think moral bookkeeping has a perfectly reasonable role to play. Keeping score, like letting people's actions tell you who they are. I think that's legitimate. But I think that forgiveness kind of transcends that space. And I think that's why, in particular instances, I don't want to say it's obligatory, but also I think it's what makes it so powerful, that it goes beyond what the wrongdoer is entitled to insist they deserve. Luke, both of us have published on forgiveness, and you've got a great book on the topic. And one of the things you do in your book is you push back a bit on my view, and you argue that in the case of somebody who's like really apologized and done all the work, it seems a bit harsh to not forgive. Doesn't that make it plausible that you ought to forgive in that kind of case? And I think that's a good place to push my view, because I think that's one of the cases in which it seems most plausible that you ought to forgive. And I do think the wrongdoer doing all that work is one of the things that makes forgiveness reasonable and maybe psychologically possible and a live option in many cases. But I think that there is, in this idea we were talking about earlier of holding something against someone, so the wrongdoer could say sorry and apologize and make up and make amends, and you could accept that and not be angry anymore and be willing to move forward with them. But you could still have a little proportionate check in your little emotional record keeping. So what I'm interested in is when that emotional little mark you have in your little black book is not disproportionate. I'm not railing at you. I'm not saying this characterizes all of you. I'm not saying you're all bad, but I clocked it and, I'm not forgetting it. Like that's there and that's on the record. I don't think that even somebody who's quite contrite is entitled to insist that it's off the record.
What transformative work do you think can be done by forgiveness?
So I think that this highly elective, potentially unconditional response of giving the wrongdoer something that goes beyond what they deserve, those very features which make forgiveness, I think, not obligatory, are also what I think make it so powerful. The Canadian-US philosopher Victoria McGeer, who actually also spends a lot of time in Australia, she's written a lot about the role of these emotional responses in what she calls scaffolding our moral characters, so helping us be better persons. So the powerful work that I think forgiveness can do is that I think we all have a deep need to see ourselves as good. And that need to see ourselves as good can make it quite hard for us to take on board our wrongdoing because it threatens that view of ourselves as good. And that makes us very prone to make excuses for ourselves. And to be too prone to leniency, to be too prone to mistaking the fact that we've apologized for the fact that we're already different and the person should have moved on already. And when somebody forgives you, I think they're seeing you in this optimistic and hopeful way that sees you as better than what your wrongdoing indicated you to be. So one of the things Victoria McGeer has powerfully written about is that this can help you actually be that way. People will sometimes give you moral exemplars and hold up wonderful people to you. That's sort of saying, like, try to be like someone else. But in this case, what can be sort of energizing or galvanizing to the person is this idea of just trying to be like, she already sees me. And that, I think, is the sort of deep galvanizing work that it can do in relationships.
In my final question, I want to go back to where we started. I want to think about the June Steenkamp and Oscar Pistorius case. Now, June, in her communication with journalists, made it very clear that she has already forgiven Oscar. She still wants punishment to be imposed on him, and she's still very much in conflict with Oscar over the wrong, but she says that she's forgiven him. Now, some philosophers might wonder whether June really has forgiven Oscar if she still wants to punish him and still remains in conflict with him. Is there potentially a kind of wishful thinking in June? She wants to have forgiven him, but in fact, she's still very much holding that wrong against Oscar.
Certainly, there can be cases where one can be, cynical or question or suspicious of what somebody in the media has claimed, but I would be a bit reluctant to make any kind of definitive pronouncement about what's really inside somebody else's heart. On my view, forgiveness is a kind of, or at least essentially involves a kind of inner psychological change, and we can't look into her heart to really see whether or not she's made it. But there's a separate question, which is forgiving compatible with thinking that punishment is appropriate? Because you might think, well, we don't need to look inside her heart. The mere fact that she's wanting punishment tells us that she hasn't really forgiven. There are at least two further complications with that. The one is that we talk about punishment in different ways. So one form of punishment is just interpersonal responses, like sulking. Your partner could punish you by sulking at you. And then a completely different sense of punishment is a state-imposed sanction for law-breaking. And I think the justification of state-imposed sanctions for law-breaking are completely different to these interpersonal responses. I think they are about upholding the law. The idea that legal punishment is required or is often required for a breach of law, I think is just in a different sort of logical space to the question of this interpersonal response. So I think she could think that it's appropriate for the state to uphold the law in response to a crime while still thinking that her own personal emotional view of the individual has changed.
I'm Luke Russell from the Discipline of Philosophy at the University of Sydney. And in this episode of The Philosophy of Living Well, you've been listening to Lucy Allais discuss the question of whether we choose to forgive. Thanks, Lucy.
Thanks, Luke. It was great chatting to you.
This podcast series is presented by the Discipline of Philosophy in the School of Humanities at the University of Sydney.